Opinion seems to be divided on the matter of what constitutes a stealth game. With video games like Metal Gear Solid, Thief, Splinter Cell, Tenchu and Hitman, stealth quickly became a favourite aspect of modern gameplay. So much so that role-playing games, first-person shooters, adventure games and other genres began to include stealth sections and abilities. But what exactly are stealth games? Are they games with sneaky gameplay as an option? Or perhaps where stealth is mechanically sacred, a method of play that gamers must stick to without fail? If we can use guns, magic, or hardcore combat to succeed, does that really count as stealth gameplay? Does this mysterious thing we like to call the stealth genre even exist in video games? And assuming it does, what could possibly divide it from other video game genres? Before we look at those questions, it's probably better to ask, how did those first influential stealth-based games come to exist? When did we learn to hide in the dark with the monsters? Of course, stealth games didn't just pop into existence. For about 10 years, between 1980 and 1990, some video games would feature gameplay that relied on the player avoiding confrontation wherever possible. During this period, the concepts of stealth gameplay were tweaked and refined to become more sophisticated, eventually leading to the stealth games we know and love today. This was the decade of the Proto-Stealth video game. Pac-Man introduced some important gameplay concepts back in 1980 that came to define Proto-Stealth games. Players eat the dots and fruit in every level, while avoiding the ghosts who can kill Pac-Man instantly. In this sense, Pac-Man is about avoiding contact with the enemy while attempting to make as much progress as possible. The AI algorithms of Pac-Man's ghost were programmed by Dr. Toru Iwatani, and it seems that if you get too close to these colourful miscreants, they become alerted to Pac-Man and begin to chase him. This interpretation of the ghost's behaviour patterns has led people to believe that Pac-Man is the first example of a game that used stealth-based gameplay. This is in fact untrue. Let's examine why. In an interview first published way back in 1986 in a book called Programmers at Work, edited by Susan Lammers, Dr. Iwatani described the AI of the Pac-Man ghost as being increasingly reactive to the player over a period of time. Although Iwatani himself has never given a detailed breakdown of each ghost's AI, veteran Pac-Man players have noted distinct patterns in default enemy movements. Pinky is fast, but moves randomly through each level. Blinky, the red ghost, uses a tracking algorithm and chases Pac-Man constantly. The blue ghost, Inky, initially moves away from Pac-Man, but then chases him if the player gets too close. Clyde, the orange ghost, is slower than the others, and, like its pink counterpart, moves in a random fashion through each level. Pac-Man's enemies were programmed to converge on the player in waves, intermittently resuming their default AI behaviours. Now, what's important for us to recognise here, in the context of stealth-based gameplay, is that Pac-Man's enemies are constantly aware of and responding to the player's position in the in-game environment. Stealth gameplay operates on the basis that players are initially unseen by enemies. Because no process of detection is taking place here, we cannot call Pac-Man an early example of a stealth game. Nevertheless, Pac-Man is relevant and interesting, because it introduced users to a key idea that defines the appeal of stealth games, avoiding confrontation with enemies who are more powerful than we are by default. However, it was not the first video game to deliver true stealth-based gameplay. That honour belongs to a little-known arcade game made by Sega back in 1981. It was 005 that first had players sneaking past enemies who had no clue where the player was lurking. 005 had the usual arcade mixture of shooting and dodging troublesome pixels, with one crucial difference. As a spy on the run, your task was to enter each building on the map and make sure both yourself and your briefcase full of secret documents made it to a waiting helicopter on the roof. Upon entering darkened warehouses, guards would be patrolling the area with flashlights. The only way to avoid the flashlight beams was to hide behind crates. But if the guards spotted you and chased you down, you lost a life. There's little doubt that these stealth gameplay segments were intended to change the pace of 005's traditional shoot and avoid gameplay. Nevertheless, Sega had inadvertently become the first developer to introduce stealth to gamers, and as such 005 holds a Guinness World Record for officially being the first stealth video game. It's also worth noting that the simplicity of cover-based stealth would go on to influence other major Proto-Stealth titles, as well as video games released today. Later in the same year, MUSE Software released Castle Wolfenstein on the Apple II series of home computers, a top-down game where players had to move from room to room, either sneaking past the guards or eliminating them. It was possible to disguise yourself using enemy uniforms, which you could loot from dead guards or find in chests throughout the castle, and these disguises were enough to get you past the basic foot soldiers. However, the SS officers lurking around were less easily fooled, and if alerted to your identity, guards could chase you from one area to another. Killing these troublesome foes was a messy way to go about things. They could be alerted by the sound of gunshots and grenades going off, but you were able to draw your gun and get solitary guards to surrender, which was handy, as you could then search them for useful items such as keys and passes to new areas. Lockpicking also had a prominent role in the game, creating an added source of tension as you made progress. Where 005 only had stealth sections as arguably something of an afterthought, Castle Wolfenstein embraced the idea of stealth with wholehearted glee. Another thing we can admire about Castle Wolfenstein is how players had to hide in plain sight, disguised as someone they weren't, an idea that would be echoed in future stealth game franchises. Castle Wolfenstein only just missed out on being the first video game to use stealth gameplay. However, it was the first stealth game to use audio cues for enemies, which gave the Nazi soldiers a truly human presence in the virtual world. For the time, at least. This made Castle Wolfenstein a popular title among early gamers, not least because it was the first proto-stealth game to launch on home computers, including the famous Atari and Commodore 64 models. MUSE Software made improvements to the Castle Wolfenstein formula for its sequel, Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, which again launched on the Apple II series a couple of years later. Beyond Castle Wolfenstein allowed players to adopt even craftier tactics, with a dagger for silent kills and the freedom to drag dead guards' bodies into concealment. The guards themselves had a more diverse set of reactions to players. If spotted, you were summoned over to the guard who demanded that you show a pass. Every single time. Yes, it does get old, but hey, progress. Each floor in the castle had a different pass you had to acquire, either by finding one in a closet or stealing one from a dead guard, but failing that, there was the option to bribe any inquisitive enemies with an unspecified amount of money. If you didn't offer enough, the alarm was raised and shooting your way out was the last, often fatal, resort. As with Castle Wolfenstein, officers were able to chase you from room to room, or set off an alarm that turned all guards against you, so remaining undetected by the enemy was still of the highest importance. In Beyond Castle Wolfenstein, we can begin to appreciate the delicate balance that exists within stealth gameplay, the balance between allowing the player to confront obstacles and allowing the player to avoid them, in an ostensibly passive system. We will discuss this balance in more detail in future episodes, but for now it's just important to remember that it is the fulcrum upon which stealth gameplay evolved and continues to grow. The 1986 game Infiltrator recognised that players wanted more direct action elements in addition to their helpings of sneakiness. Taking cues from Wolfenstein, developer Chris Gray had players using disguises and credentials to trick foes, albeit without any grainy voice effects. You were also given a helicopter to fly from base to base, a feature that seems to echo 005's helicopter sections. Infiltrator attempted to make its world just that little bit more immersive, mixing top-down landscapes with side-viewed underground bunkers and first-person helicopter flights. Players had to rummage through desks, closets and drawers in search of precious secret documents, after which they could return to their home base. While not much more than a cosmetic upgrade to the Proto-Stealth groundwork already laid extensively by the WOLFENSTEIN games, Infiltrator was the first Proto-Stealth game to not allow any direct killing of enemies, who had to be dealt with using sleeping gas instead. It was in 1987 that a certain Japanese developer launched a Proto-Stealth game that would go on to spawn an entire series across multiple hardware generations. That developer's name was Hideo Kojima. The very first entry into the gigantic Metal Gear franchise combines a number of Proto-Stealth gameplay features, including limited ammunition and items that could be used to bypass specific areas. More than that, it offers features commonly used in mainstream games such as boss fights and shooting sequences. In an article on NowGamer.com, Hideo Kojima described Metal Gear as an idea born from adverse situations. Originally conceived as a military action game, Metal Gear was turned towards stealth-oriented gameplay because of the MSX2 home computer's hardware limitations. Enemies' vision in Metal Gear was restricted to straight lines, meaning it was possible to sneak past guards who were walking in the opposite direction as long as you didn't move directly in front of them. Basic? Yes. However, by giving enemies a literal line of sight, Metal Gear makes it obvious to players how they can reliably avoid detection. This clarity of stealth gameplay was something users hadn't seen since 005, where the guards' torch beams denoted the limits of their detection fields. Players could punch guards to death without alerting others nearby, and later in the game they could also acquire a silencer for their handgun. The in-game soundtrack was situational. It changed from moderate-paced infiltration music to a rapid, combative theme whenever the player was detected. Metal Gear was the first Proto-Stealth game to use an upgrade system by way of promotions. Users could attain health and inventory boosts after rescuing a certain number of hostages. If hostages were killed, accidentally or otherwise, it was possible to lose those upgrades. It was also the first Proto-Stealth game where the player and their in-game allies were in constant communication. Depending on what area you were in, your friends could offer advice on how to proceed. Last but certainly not least, Metal Gear gave players a disguise to use, the glorious cardboard box, which was effective as long as you remained still while guards were watching. So if you ever wondered where that classic visual joke came from, you now have your answer. In Metal Gear, there were obvious benefits in place for remaining undetected, and the punishments for breaking cover while taxing on a player's resources of ammo and rations weren't game-breakingly harsh. The weapons players could use were varied and interesting. Perhaps the reason why Metal Gear made the kind of impact that it did was because, unlike its forebears, it managed to provide a nice balance between stealth and all-out action gameplay. 3 years later, in 1990, Kojima perfected his Proto-Stealth formula with a sequel. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was released with the tagline Tactical Espionage Game, suggesting that players had to approach its challenges with a certain amount of thought and care, rather than the gung-ho approach typical of mainstream games at the time. The rules of engagement had definitely changed since Metal Gear. Indeed, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake represents a critical point in stealth game development, a culmination of all the work done by developers in the Proto-Stealth period, and as such it can be argued as being the first video game to offer a comprehensive stealth gameplay experience. Stealth elements were not only brought together as they had been in Metal Gear, but developed beyond their initial parameters to be more functional, giving rise to ideas that would influence all video games that wanted to include stealth mechanisms. For starters, enemies were able to turn their heads, which made encounters with guards much more interesting. They responded to more sounds made by the player. In addition to explosives and unsilenced gunshots, they could hear Snake walking on loud metal surfaces, or when he punched walls. Finally, guards were no longer restricted to one area and could move across multiple screens, taking a leaf out of Castle Wolfenstein's book. With such improvements on how enemies behaved and operated, it was only natural that players should be able to counter this with improved mechanics of their own, and Kojima and his team didn't disappoint. You could hide under obstacles or in air ducts, safely tucked away from the guard's eyesight. A tracking radar was displayed in the top right corner of the screen. The choice to include a radar that told players where their foes were at all times opened out the stealth experience in a truly meaningful way. No longer was the screen you were looking at the only thing that mattered. You now had to consider the in-game landscape around you and be mindful of any guards who were patrolling it. Crucially, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was the first stealth-based game to include 3 distinct modes of enemy awareness. There was the passive state of awareness, where guards routinely patrolled areas. The suspicious state of awareness, where a question mark hovered over foes' heads after they heard the player making noise, where guards would move to investigate whatever disturbed their patrol. And then there was the alerted state of awareness, where an exclamation point briefly appeared over enemies' heads before they engaged the player in combat. During alert mode, the player's radar was disabled, rendering them prone to run into trouble if they panicked and ran all over the place. The question mark and exclamation point have since become iconic visual indicators for the Metal Gear franchise, but have also been used elsewhere in video games, particularly stealth titles. These simple visual indicators are an easy way for players to know when their sneaky activities have been compromised, and to what degree they have been compromised. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake used a countdown system when players triggered a high alert, denoting exactly how long the alert would last for. To make the countdown disappear, you could take out the guards who had seen you or attempt to hide. Once the countdown dropped to 0, enemy awareness would reset from alerted to suspicious and eventually passive, after which enemies would resume their patrols. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was also the first stealth-based game where you could distract enemies by making noise deliberately. Kojima and his team at Konami had created the most influential stealth experience to date, and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake remains one of the best-loved titles of the 8-bit hardware generation. When you step back and take a really hard look at the systems it implemented, it is not difficult to see why. Metal Gear 2 is the first example of a true stealth game, a culmination of all the gameplay elements that worked across the Proto-Stealth period. This sequel marks the end of the Proto-Stealth period and the beginning of stealth games in earnest, where developers started to think about more involved systems of gameplay. Despite Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake's popularity and mainstream critical acclaim, dedicated stealth games would remain tucked away in the shadows until later in the 1990s, when 32-bit and 64-bit consoles and more powerful home computers had become the gaming standard. The advent of true 3D game design reignited interest in stealth-based gameplay. In 1998, 3 significant video games were released that would change gaming history, and even challenge preconceptions of what video games could achieve. Join me in part 2, where I'll be discussing the class of '98. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.